Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, whatever time you are watching this final video for History of Philosophy. The last one I made was for the midterm, and I was asked by a couple of students to do a brief one for the final test. Some of you have written the test already, so obviously you probably don't need to watch this, but it is a brief review of the main points, the main ideas that are in the course. So this test structured the same way, 10 true-false questions at the beginning out of 10. The second section, identify and explain, and I think there's like 14 or 15 different terms. Just pick five that you're comfortable with, you're familiar with, you remember them, and there's some option, of course, as there is with the final part, the long answer question, where there's many different ways you can approach it. I'll give you a heads up. The question has to do with modernity. So just think of that, because it is a link that really ties together in fact, most of the second half of this course, and it was designed that way. So the other section in the test, section 3, short answer questions, and again, literally short answers. They can be answered in just a few sentences. Each one of those is out of 5. The long answer one is out of 15, with a total of 50. Okay, so let's get through the course here. What I've done is I've summarized the material in as brief as possible, sort of chunk of time, because you only have until Sunday night, and my marks have to be in about a day or so later, so I want to be able to mark everything. Okay, so Module 8, we looked at the Scottish Enlightenment. That was a period of time in the early 18th century, so we're talking late 1700s, Scottish intellectual life. There's a remarkable amount of activity in philosophy, intellectual endeavors, legal, architectural, scientific, industrial. Everything is blooming and blossoming. And the Scottish Enlightenment had a very similar sort of tone and characteristics as the European one. It had the same sort of humanist, mechanical or mechanistic and rational outlook on the world, much like the continental philosophies, Descartes in particular. They had a strong sense of practicality, common sense, a very strong emphasis on reason, not superstition, not tradition, but reason. So the continental version of the Enlightenment worshipped the altar of ideas, and the Scottish Enlightenment did so as well, but they also focused on social improvement, civic virtue. They found that very important. Morality, also important. And also, too, the practical benefits of the individual and society working together as a whole. Now, the Western world had to wait for this stage in human development to occur, because prior to that, there was really a very strong prohibition by the powers that be, which at that point was the church. So the church did not like criticism. It still doesn't like criticism, but it especially didn't back then, because it could basically sentence people to death for heresy. So it was a matter of gently but firmly pushing back over several hundred years before the atmosphere, the situation changed so that people could speak more openly. So there was a prohibition of any kind of criticism, especially negative, on any kind of questions about the accepted state of affairs, the way the world was. The world is either flat or it's round, and if it's round, it stays stationary and the sun goes around it. No, it doesn't. Everything was up for grabs. So the Scottish Enlightenment thinkers started kind of early forms of economics and sociology. They called it the science of man. I apologize, but that's what it was called. The science of human beings really is what it is. And so this particular idea here was the study of the way society, politics, and economics interact. Adam Ferguson looked at the issue of active citizenship, courage, civic virtue, much like he saw and appreciated in ancient Greece, and tried to apply it to modern industrial societies. And as you can imagine, it didn't quite fit very well, but it was still worth looking at. And he placed his faith in the principles of morality and the realization of moral perfection. So that's a kind of Aristotelian teleology, right? The end point of something. So the end point of a human being for Ferguson was moral perfection. So morality never escaped the purview of Ferguson, nor Adam Smith, who is considered to be the founder of political economy. He wrote the very famous Wealth of Nations, and this is the book that starts classical free market economic theory, and in a sense the discipline of economics as well. So that starts at this particular point. And so just as I'm speaking, whoops, I'm going to move this just a little bit here. Okay, so Smith was very important in laying this foundation. He was also interested in self-interest and competition that would lead to economic prosperity. He thought that globalization and tariffs were very important because these were, again, very new things. And yet here he was writing about them in 1770s. Now, the biggest and most important change was the division of labor. That was what was important, even more so than his idea of the invisible hand, this idea of a supplier and someone who was looking to sell a product, finding in the marketplace someone who needs a product. And together, this invisible hand would bring these individuals into the same realm so they could benefit. So the person selling something is not being selfish because they're still helping society. They might make a small profit. And again, keep your moral compass intact and you'll be fine. So that's essentially what Smith was arguing. Now, that moral compass was very important because Smith also argued that a business-dominated political system, which is absolutely what we have today, we have a business-dominated political system. In other words, corporations and business interests really set the agenda. They're the ones who lay down laws that always benefit them. And if it happens to not benefit us, so what? Corporations and business and economics always need to move forward. So Smith already warned us in 1776 that this kind of a political system would allow a conspiracy of businesses and industry to influence politics and legislate themselves any kind of positive outcome, really at the expense of us. So this is something Smith warned us about. And guess what? We only read half the book, right? First half, yay, division of labor, but the second half on the moral imperatives that we need to maintain during our economic development, a few people lost sight of that. So very important. So that's Module 8. Module 9, okay, 7 minutes, good. I'm going to try to sort of whip through each one. Module 9, we talk about Hegel. And Hegel was a very important German idealist philosopher, and he wrote basically many, many books. But the most important one, there are two, Phenomenology of Spirit, very difficult book to read through. I don't recommend reading it until you're good and prepared to engage with it, because it is very satisfying, but very difficult. And Philosophy of Spirit, Philosophy of Right, where he describes this notion of spirit, or Geist, as he called it, as it develops historically and economically and politically. So the philosophy of spirit, this is this notion that there's a historical development that integrates literally everything into one cohesive whole. So Geist, this ephemeral thing, expresses itself through us and kind of loses its way, it loses itself and brings itself back into being through us. So we are its servants, and Geist is a way in which Hegel was able to understand the way in which society and economics and history and religion and philosophy, all of these things are kind of interrelated. So Geist is this kind of interconnection between all these various humanly made institutions. And so what Hegel did was create this very important historical force. Now, you can take it or leave it. I'm not saying it's correct or wrong or right, but it is a way to understand history. And certainly one of the debates against it is the fact that history is unpredictable. But Hegel still said, no, the cunning of reason, they can twist every which way, it'll find itself back on track. Okay. Now, the other thing, too, was that Hegel also believed that the opinions of the philosopher were not important because opinions could be subjective. Subjective ideas could also lead to error. And Hegel really wanted to show how the development of philosophy, because he is talking about spirit, right, about Geist, working its way through history. And he says, no, the aim that I wish to show is that the opponent's view, even if he doesn't agree with them, it still develops into his own comprehensive view of the world. And so each opponent is still a cog in a wheel, a part of a whole. And the whole is this notion of spirit. So Hegel never criticized people that he didn't agree with. He simply discussed them and showed how they simply understood to the best of their abilities at that time. So he doesn't fault them, only to the degree that this is the best they could do at the time. And he said, look, no one can leap beyond their own age, right? I don't have a crystal ball. I can't look into the future. I can only see behind me. So as I look at the world through my rearview mirror, I understand how we get to the point that we're at. And so this is how Hegel was able to understand the development of the world, by saying, no, even if it's not something that was absolutely correct, there is still a grain of truth in it. So the cunning of reason, which is this, what I've just described, the way in which reason can sort of get itself back on track. Over the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen all kinds of upheavals as the world shifted more and more to the right, more and more oppressive, more and more rigid and violent. Then we had the pandemic, and all of us are kind of sort of coming out of this fog going, what happened? Where have we been for the last 6 or 7 years? And the cunning of reason, whether it's a rule of law or reintegrating ourselves into society, we'll get back on track. Now, one of the ways, one of the things that we encounter as we sort of lose our way is what Hegel called alienation. And alienation is also something that Marx picks up. And for Hegel, when the unity that we have with the world, with one another, with ourselves, with society at large, when that disappears from human life, then we have a fragmented view of the world, right, of modernity. And it becomes a task of philosophy to restore it. So alienation is that disconnect that emerges out of that much more simple unity that we have either with ourselves, with our friends, our family, our community, our neighborhood, our city, right? And we disconnect at some point. But Hegel says, no, fear not, because we can reintegrate ourselves, much like spirit loses itself in the world and it reintegrates itself through philosophy and art and religion. We too can do the same thing. Our spirit might become alienated, but we rediscover it as we enter into relationships with people, enter into relationships with the world. And all of this brings us back. So for Hegel, there is the capacity to overcome alienation. Now, first of all, he thought it was through love, right? The love of another person. Secondly, he believed it was through philosophy. Second was religion. And then finally, he integrated both of those into philosophy proper. So he says, look, we can reconcile the alienation involved in the development of human culture, and philosophy was the way in which we could unify these givens and overcome alienation. Now, Marx would later on say that, okay, that's all fine and good, but that's in theory, right? We explain everything. We flatten out all these contradictions, but in theory only. The world is still alienating. Economics and capitalism is still alienating. So that's my little segue into the next section. But that is the argument that Marx makes against Hegel. And he's a part of a group of thinkers called the left Hegelians. So we're now to module 10. So as you can imagine, Hegel did have his critics. And once he died, his ideas were increasingly radicalized. The right simply said, Hegel got it right. We're going to tie all this up in a nice little pink ribbon, check off a few more boxes. We're good. But the younger or left Hegelians, of which Marx and Feuerbach were part of, they wanted to sort of re-engage with that critical edge that Hegel had. Because as he took the world apart, right, that's the part that was dialectical and critical. He kind of put it back together again because, remember, his job is not to criticize and change the world. It's only to interpret it. So Hegel just wished to interpret the world, not to break it all apart. But Feuerbach and Marx engaged in this sort of critical theory that really was thorough. It was society, religion, institutions of one sort or another. Feuerbach, for example, went back to the phenomenology of spirit and looked at the unhappy consciousness. This was one of many different ideas that Hegel discussed in that book. And Feuerbach says, no, that's us, right? We are unhappy because we don't fit in the society. The society is at odds with us through modernity, through religion, through these various, political and social and economic institutions. And so at the time that Feuerbach is writing, which would be about the 1830s, The chief obstacle, right, the chief object of criticism was religion. Because in 19th century Germany, any kinds of questions regarding religion were really questions about social and political life, about behavior and duties and expectations and submission, right? Submission to the will of the religion. So that became the problem. And Hegel's, what he called his positivism, right? His positivism could not become the basis for a truly critical theory because it was simply a justification for the status quo. So what do I mean by that briefly? Hegel's positivism is simply stating that a person states that it is what it is, and that's all there is to it. Because I said it, that would be all the authority I need, as opposed to understanding a statement saying, no, just because you are the head of some department or a group or institution or whatever, doesn't give you the right to make a blanket statement and not have us question it. So the kind of positivism that we see in Hegel is the kind that simply, at the end of the day, justifies the status quo. And religion, in this case, serves that moral and political order. But the moral and political order was also becoming increasingly hypocritical. And this is where Feuerbach and Marx kind of step in. So Feuerbach argued a traditional religion and philosophy were radically flawed, right? What they needed was a brand new form, something that would lead to true human emancipation, right? Freedom. And not so just freedom, but liberty. So Feuerbach's theory held out the promise of this radical redemption that would take place through the elimination of all kinds of oppressive faculties upon our consciousness, religious, philosophical, and so on. And for Feuerbach, all these oppressive forms of consciousness were keeping us from achieving our own true spiritual grandeur. All the things that we projected onto God and onto this spiritual figure, they were really us. It was us in our best form possible. And Feuerbach thought that religion and certain forms of philosophy, such as positivism, was holding us back. Now, Marx kind of took up the mantle. Now, he went well past Feuerbach, but he too engaged in what he called a ruthless criticism of everything existing. And he called this transformational criticism. And so he took what Feuerbach had discussed and he applied it to Hegel's philosophy of spirit and really worked through religion and realized, no, religion is not really the main problem. We want to eliminate the situation that would lead to the need for religion in the first place. And that's the work he was doing. So he moved well past Feuerbach's position regarding religion as being oppressive and positivist. And he says, no, we need to go much further. What we are experiencing now through capitalism and industrialization is the crushing of our human essence. Forget it coming into bloom. The way in industry and capitalism are going, it's going to crush us and turn us into machines. So Marx was very much afraid that the Industrial Revolution was destroying Aristotle's sense of a political community because it was divided up. And basically, we've got workers and then we've got owners of property and owners of an industry. So there's going to be some confrontation between these two groups. Hegel's notion of mutual recognition. How can you recognize someone when they're all the same, right? We're all just workers. And we're working in an industry that's almost 110 decibels with just sheer racket. We can't talk to each other. And even Kant's desire, I know we didn't talk about Kant in this course, but Kant's desire that individuals should be treated as equals, right? Not unequals, and as ends in themselves. So truly authentic human beings are slowly eroding, and the essence that makes us uniquely human is disappearing because of industrialization. So that's essentially Marx's argument. So module 11, we go on to Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, and the Age of Doubt. So this is the second half of the 19th century. Schopenhauer, who was a kind of very short-lived Hegelian, and he thought that the ultimate reality was the expression of the Wille, right, the will or desire. And this is something that Nietzsche would later pick up on as what he called the will to power. And so Schopenhauer's vision was a kind of model for a rather pessimistic view of human freedom. But was it as pessimistic or was it maybe just realistic, right? I would argue it's the second one. And the individual's instinctual nature to basically express themselves through the villa, right, through the will, and whether or not we can do this successfully and find our freedom. And so the idea that our instinctual nature, right, that it exists, for Schopenhauer, it went completely against what Hegel called rational freedom, because this is a kind of freedom that Hegel believed was possible if we submit completely to moral laws that are based on reason. Schopenhauer and later Nietzsche argued very clearly that we should never be part of the herd. We should never submit to moral laws that we don't agree to. And Hegel says, no, you are happiest when you can. Well, they beg to differ. And so instead, Schopenhauer said, look, we are material beings. We live in our body, we have desires, and we wish to express those desires, right? The life of the body, rather than the mind, is the driving force of existence. And desire, again, expressed in every possible way. Intellectual desire, sexual desire, those things are the materiality or the material aspects of the world. And this is what Schopenhauer kind of brings to the table for sort of the first time, because Hegel hinted at it. Marx certainly sort of took that much further. But Schopenhauer said, yes, we are human beings. We are made of matter. And having said that, he says, yeah, but life is suffering. It's not like we have to get over it. No, acknowledge that it's suffering, but at least it's authentic. It's not fake. So a life worth living is a life of compassion and a love of humanity, but it's also a life of suffering, right? Things don't come easy. And one exception that Schopenhauer made to the rule of rational thinking was what he called introspection. So introspection is the ability to look within, right? To look at who I am, what is accessible to me, what can I do, right? What can I do in this world to make it a better place? So introspection leads within about 30 or 40 years with Nietzsche to this idea of the will to power. I see something that I'm capable of accomplishing, and damn it, I will accomplish it. I will do everything I can. And yes, life may be suffering, but if you overcome those obstacles and you win, then that is authentic, and that win is yours. Oh, you've accomplished it. So introspection is an awareness that there are lies that are there in the first place, obstacles to be overcome, and you think them through. And so we're not saying that suffering is over. To overcome an obstacle, a jihad, for example, that's what that word means. To overcome something. So to have a jihad against the world, against those obstacles, means that yes, you will suffer, but you will gain something in the end. Not only authentic life, but a degree of liberty that you didn't have before. So that is essentially what Schopenhauer gives to us in the history of philosophy. Kierkegaard, writing with a little bit of overlap, he too was a critic of modernity, much like Nietzsche, much like Marx. And for him, humanity, this alleged progress, right? Because remember, there's progress and then the sort of technological advancements. And it seems like the more technological advancements move forward, our individuality and our progress as human beings seems to kind of get left behind. And Kierkegaard is arguing exactly that point. So this alleged progress was a complete illusion. Humanity was dehumanizing and robbing itself of its individuality, stripping itself of its singularity, what makes it particular, what makes it unique, and really what makes us human beings. So for Kierkegaard, we were turning into basically just a mass of people, what he called mass man. So when we talk about mass media, for example, that's where that idea originally comes from. The notion that as we are, our humanity, our essence, our uniqueness, our particularity is all kind of crushed and eroded away by industry, by institutions, by modernity. We're just kind of a big blob of nothing and something, right? Nothing in terms of human essence, but something in terms of, well, what am I? I'm a consumer. I'm just a passive consumer. And Kierkegaard's going, no, don't be that. That's not what we want to do. We want to do the opposite. We want to live, right? We want to be authentic. So Kierkegaard, and again later Nietzsche, because that's the connection here, they too, in trying to figure out how to move forward through this, they gave up systematic thinking. Now, the last great exponent of this kind of thinking was Hegel. The Hegelian system is a complex, fascinating, but ultimately kind of empty system because it does not leave any room for criticism. It takes the world apart, but then it kind of puts it back essentially the way he found it, right? Because when he takes it apart, he looks to see what the interconnections are, but doesn't criticize them and say, well, they should change, right? For Hegel, the job of a philosopher is to interpret the world, not to change it the way that Marx saw it. So Kierkegaard thought that systematic thinking was not a good thing because of a whole range of reasons. One, the system is limited and restricted, and it's not open to alternatives, to criticism. The first one here, it cannot accommodate the complexity and contingency of the known world, right? The uniqueness and particularity, the flavor, right? The flavor of everyday life is gone in a system. So that's one. Two, it's limiting and restricted and not open to alternatives. Three, it's cognitive and retrospective. In other words, it's only after we've done something that we go back and we look for themes and consistencies to create our system, rather than being practical and prospective, what's coming up in the future. Four, a system is groundless and it only expresses the personality of the systematizer. Plato did the same thing. Hegel did the same thing. Anyone who creates a system thinks that they're being objective when in fact they're still putting some of their personality into it, even Hegel. And so to create a system is to imply that you are creating something that is purely objective, when in fact it's not. And the fifth one is a system cannot accommodate the reflectiveness of the human mind. As we work through our lives and we overcome obstacles, things change. New obstacles come into view. The older obstacles may have changed us in some way. And systematic thinking just does not account for this kind of forward view, right? Moving towards a goal. And Nietzsche looked at this, the existentialists looked at this, and this is where the connection is between Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and the existentialists that we're going to look at shortly. So Nietzsche, again, very important. He too was appalled by the notion of democracy and modern ideas and modernity. He thought that morality was hypocritical. It was a delusion. People could be the worst individuals in the world, but as long as they went to church on Sunday, everything was okay. And Nietzsche said, no. Again, you have to live authentically, not hypocritically. And so if that's the case, we need to make sure that whatever it is that is good for that community, it has to be good for us. Because if it isn't, then we should not be part of it. And this includes morality. And again, as I mentioned before, the individual, according to Nietzsche, should never subordinate itself to the group. If the group is going in the wrong direction, Nietzsche believes that no, we have every right to fight against it. Now, that doesn't mean you destroy the world or kill people. It means that from an aesthetic or from a moral point of view, yes, you decide that you are not going to follow the group because you do not approve of the direction they're going in. So for Nietzsche, brutality and nihilism are the only roads to progress. We make laws only for ourselves because they are the ones that matter to us. So don't try to confront reality because reality is not situated and constructed the way you want it. You need to go out and do the work, right? You've got to do the work to change things. So Nietzsche, as much as he sounds like he's just bitching about the world, he is, but he says we need to change it. It doesn't mean we sit back and we whine, but we confront reality knowing that there will be obstacles, there will be suffering, but once we get on the other side of that, then we are able to engage in authentic living. So the way in which he does this, he writes many different books. There are many different many different Nietzsches, so definitely in the plural. But in Beyond Good and Evil, written in 1886, Nietzsche comes up with this notion of will to power, and specifically how it is manifested in what he calls master morality and slave morality. Master morality is the morality of the proud and the strong, and those that engage with the world. And slave morality is a morality of the groveling, the weak and the pathetic, who blame everyone else but themselves, who don't see any avenue out of the situation that they're in. Now, these two modes can be corrupted by modernity. They can also corrode the human, the health of the human soul. So we need to be careful that when we are engaging with the world, we do it in a way that is not criminal, that we don't decide, well, as Nietzsche himself said, we will be masters without slaves. In other words, those are trigger words. Absolutely. Master and slave should be. But what he means by being a master is to be able to be the master of your domain, your life, your existence, the situation you find yourself in. So if that is the case, then we need to understand the relationship between morality and the will to power. And so for Nietzsche, the master morality expresses and honors and institutionalizes the political life of the proud state, right? The proud state of the souls. Actions are good because you decide that they're good in themselves. You're the one who decides what is morally good, what is morally valuable. But again, at no point does Nietzsche say that you need to be a criminal. That's not what he's saying. But he does say instead that we need to make sure that we understand the difference between these two, because slave morality, by its definition, is a kind of utility, right? It attaches values to qualities that really sort of celebrate a slave's weakness and their suffering. And this is why Nietzsche really didn't like religion, because religion sort of wraps itself around this notion of suffering and weakness, that somehow this is good. Nietzsche says, no, it doesn't have to be this way. And so the first step that you engage with as you move out of the slave state and into the path towards mastery is to acknowledge that you are resentful of the situation you're in. So if you're going to suffer and be weak, you're not going to be resentful. But when you are, and you acknowledge envy and jealousy and resentment, that's the first step. So because of that, and this is one of the odd things about Nietzsche, is he actually privileges, or the slaves privilege, modernity and progress. Even though he says he doesn't like it, there's something very ambivalent in Nietzsche's work, and I've taught this course many times, and I still don't know. I think he honors both, but he says slaves are the ones that fight the strongest, because even in Hegel's work, the slave can basically look around and see the world that they've created. The master, on the other hand, needs the slave to identify him or herself. So hopefully that makes sense. So the slave looks around, says, I've created all this. I'm the one who worked hard. This is my world. But the master can't do that. They haven't done anything. So there's something honorable. I think there's something sacred about the slave in this particular sort of discussion. Okay, so the last two here, 13 and 14, Sartre and Deboval on existentialism. So here are some working definitions of existentialism. The concern with the individual, with concrete human existence. That should sound familiar. That should be Marx and Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche. 2, because we are free, we become responsible for everything we do. And again, that goes even back to Smith and Ferguson, right? That moral compass that we have. We are responsible for everything we do. 3, we're also free to wake up and live a more authentic life. That's something that we hear as early as Schopenhauer. And finally, one of these really important phrases from Sartre, existence precedes essence. Our human essence is not something we walk into the room with fully formed. It is through our existence, our interactions, our words, our deeds, our acts, that we create an existence upon which then people can then decide what our essence is. Are you a good person, a bad person, a giving person, a reasonable person, or are you the opposite? So this is why Sartre says that in existentialism, human existence comes before essence. It's what you do that only later defines what kind of a person you are. Just because you're a human being doesn't make you a good person. Okay, so Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, very strong connections. The fact that human existence comes first, it's a starting point. Human existence is the beginning, not some sort of logical deduction, through a kind of systematic form of thinking. It's always in the here and now. It is in this moment. And Sartre and Deboval found Nietzsche to their liking because of this kind of thinking. For Nietzsche, what was needed in order to understand how morality was maybe holding certain people back was to engage in this very deep critical form of cultural history, what he called a genealogy, right? To dig down, to find out about the psychology and history of human behavior and how it was twisted and thwarted and distorted in some way because of various institutions that wish to keep us living and acting and thinking in a certain way and not another. And because of that, if we can understand that, if we can understand that life is about living authentically, truly and in the moment, and again, that idea then segues into the last one with Debord and the Situationists, to live authentically in the moment, that is the kind of human freedom that the existentialists were looking for. And it becomes, in a sense, a call to action. So modes of existence, the types of existence that we can engage in, there are ways in which we can do it. One of the ones in which we do not and we fail is what Sartre calls bad faith. That's when a person seeks to lie to themselves and escape from the responsibility of being for self, right? Being for self is self-consciousness. So bad faith is us lying to ourselves going, what's the use, right? I'm going to fail. So you don't even try. Even if you fail, at least you've tried. But if you don't even do that, then you're acting in bad faith. You've already defeated yourself. And that's not good. So being for self, by comparison, is self-consciousness. Being in itself is a consciousness of the outside world, including other people. So there's always going to be an interaction between being for self, us, and being in itself, the world outside. Now, the three concepts of bad faith is probably the most straightforward because we understand it. We can see it, right? And again, as I mentioned, we're human beings under pressure from social forces, adopt these false values, right? And basically ignore their innate freedom, the freedom that they would have to do things. So human existence means transcendence, moving up and out, right? Not in a systematic way, after the fact, looking through a rearview mirror. No, transcendence, moving forward, rather than what he calls immanence. Immanence is simply kind of crushed like a turtle, all hiding inside a shell, right? Afraid to come out, filled with bad faith and afraid to interact with the world because you might fail. And Sartre says, no, transcend, move forward, move out and up. So we need to be vigilant every day that we don't slip back into bad faith. So the other thinker here, Simone de Beauvoir in The Second Sex, written in 1949, she, in the same way, using genealogy and the notion of human existence, overcomes or overturns all kinds of accepted ideas about human nature, but especially as they relate to women. Because in her work, she argues that women have been forced, again, notice this, bad faith, being in itself, the system sort of distorting you. She finds out and discusses the fact that women have been forced to occupy a secondary place in the world in relation to man. And at this gendered position, because gender is a social construct, it has been reinforced by educational and social traditions. So the very traditions, the ones that Nietzsche said, no, engage with them and break them if you have to, again, aesthetically and morally. And Beauvoir says, yes, absolutely. Those traditions are holding you back. So she comes up with, again, a very famous phrase, one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. And what she means by that is, as a young woman biologically is birthed, as she grows up and within society, she learns to behave differently to boys, more modestly, more properly. She thinks, carefully about dressing very prettily and not getting dirty. And all the things that happens to girls, to young girls and women, is that they end up being simply objects, right? They're positioned in space rather than defining that space, right? That situation that they're in. And everything that they do is really about immanence. It's about being static and stationary, not moving and developing. All the things that existentialism said, no, that is bad faith. So Beauvoir says, no, women have been forced to do this, and it's time to break that mold. So she says that women come to learn their learned tendency to see themselves as the other rather than the subject who is transcending. In other words, women tend to relate themselves to another person, usually a man, rather than being completely authentic and interdependent with another person. So those are the ideas that are presented. There is discussion on free choice, biology, social and cultural factors, how all of these create this gendered, right, this socially constructed human being that gradually sort of becomes set in her ways as life goes on and engaging again in a kind of bad faith. Okay, so the last one here, 40 minutes. I'm hoping to wrap up in the next 5 or so. The last module was on Debord and the Situationist International. And this is a group of individuals, thinkers, writers, not necessarily philosophers, but I wanted to add them in here because they really take many of the positive ideas that we've discussed here in the second half of the course and kind of engage with them. But there was a very strong artistic aspect to them as well. And in the 1950s, of course, following the Second World War, they challenged people's passive conditioning. Kierkegaard's, right, notion of mass man, the passive conditioning of individuals with these very carefully calculated scandals using what they called détournement. And I'm going to describe that in just a moment. But détournement or deferral or deturning or detouring or even hijacking, this was a way in which to struggle against what Debord called the society of the spectacle. And this, by the 1960s, was this all-encompassing contemporary consumer culture, commodity fetishism, the thingness of the world, buying, working all weekend to buy a new product that you might not even need. But the notion of passivity and the notion of consumerism becomes much more important in the 1950s and 60s. And this was what Debord believed was destroying society, perhaps more so than anything else. So Debord came up with this notion of situationism, although he hated the word, but being a situationist, right? Because isms infer and imply a kind of a static set of rules, and they never were. So he was a situationist, and what he meant by that was constructing spontaneous aesthetic situations. So there's a little bit of Nietzsche, a little bit of Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard, and a little bit of existentialism. As much as they critique these people, you have to admit there was part of it, because what is a constructed situation? It is a moment of life concretely, in other words, in the world, and deliberately constructed, rather than abstractly conceived or passively accepted. And you do this through what he called the collective organization of the time and space around you, right? What he called a unitary ambience. And a game of events. So there is game, chance, playfulness, all these things that as consumers, and as workers, we never get a chance to engage in because they're always so busy. We're looking at the clock, got to get to bed, got to be up at, early tomorrow because I have to be at work at 7. And Debord says, no, walk away from all this. Create your world. Create your own, your own desires. And so a constructed situation was this moment in life that was deliberately constructed by you, not given to you, you don't walk into it. And this lays open the chance or the possibility of chance, contingency, the accidental, all kinds of things can happen. And so with that in mind, Debord then went on much further and came up with this very important book that's called The Society of the Spectacle, which was simply a critique on capitalism and consumer society. Because by the 1960s, everybody was busy just buying stuff, new things or new products. There was a new product literally every other week. So, of course, the pressure from advertising was, you need to get this product X, product Y. And we are seeing it even today with iPhones. What is it, iPhone 14 now? I mean, really, is it that different than 9, 10, 11, or 12? But no, the pressure is on for us to get this brand new phone because you'll have to have it. So that's all part of the society, the spectacle, this relentless drive to consume, and especially buying things we don't even need. So Debord argues that life in consumer society is more and more dominated by what he calls the spectacle. And now what is the spectacle? It's a domination or an overload of images. The world is full of images. We are now starting to consider the world as if it was somehow two-dimensional and something we don't engage with. How many times have we heard on the news, for example, of someone or someone saying something to the effect of, it was just like a movie. just like a movie. Or to see someone and the uncle goes, oh, she's pretty as a picture. That's what Debord means. We start thinking in terms of images rather than engaging with what we see directly in front of us. And so that relationship to images becomes more important than the relationship we have to people. We think of people. Now, yourselves, the image you project is student. The image I project is instructor. But I was student at one point. I was factory worker at one point. I was musician at one point. All these things matter. But depending on who you engage with, the image that they have of you ends up speaking on your behalf. And Debord wanted to break through that facade. Say, no, this is who I am. This is who I am authentically. So real social relationships are being replaced by images. So we have relationships to images rather than human beings. And he found that very disconcerting. Now, one of the ways around that was to engage in some of these playful tactics. The one I don't mention here is psychogeography, but the two that are important, one is called dérive. Just in English, it translates to drifting or being adrift. And that's just simply just letting the day sort of wash over you, doing whatever you feel like doing. Now, typically we do this on the weekends, but when we are in our downtime, we tend not to think so much about, hey, I want to do this and that and the next thing. But there was a time when you were younger when you could just be adrift and just see what happens. Now, that was kind of a short-lived idea because eventually the world became more complex, more dangerous. There was more revolution in the air. But the other one that was still being used by Debord and still used today is détournement. And détournement simply translates to deflection, diversion, rerouting. And what it means is diverting or rerouting, misappropriating, or somehow otherwise turning something aside from its normal course or purpose, especially with advertising, especially with newspaper images. So the goal of détournement is to negate the original message, which is likely a lie, right? You need this product. No, I don't. I don't need this product. So the purpose of détournement is to de-alienate, right? To bring the message out. In other words, to turn it inside out, turn it against itself, to expose the hidden message of conditioning, conformity, compliance, and you juxtapose that with its opposite. So to conform, right, the opposite of that is to be creative. The opposite of compliance is to run away and do something else. So the image is taken, flipped on its head, or turned inside out using its own words to really say the real message, right? The hidden message that is inside that advertisement or whatever it is that you're playing with. And détournement can be done with literally anything. Piece of film, piece of music, whatever else. And we'll see it sometimes, not always successful, but we'll see it maybe in Facebook or on Facebook. Somebody will take an image and kind of mess around with it. And if it manages to say something uniquely new and perhaps more honest, that is a kind of détournement. Anyway, so that is the entire course, modules 8 right through to 14. As I mentioned, there's 4 sections in the test: true and false, identify and explain, short answer questions, and long answer, a single one that has to do with modernity. So think of that as you go through your notes. Thank you again for taking the course. Thank you again for the very nice comments that I've received from some students via email. And hopefully, if you see me in the hallway, say, "Hi, sir, I took your History of Philosophy course. I liked it, I hated it," whatever, because I haven't seen any of you, but you certainly know me. And hopefully we'll be able to see each other back in the building on a more permanent basis. In the meantime, take care, good luck on the exam, and we'll see each other soon. Bye-bye.